everybody here. Where does culture come from? So as a Darwinist, I look at culture as a product of a particular set of genes combined with a particular environment, and that's what gives us culture. But literary critic Terry Eagleton, in a recent essay in the London Review of Books, he places culture in the realm of work. So Terry Eagleton is a Marxist, and so he looks at culture as belonging to the realm of production, the realm of labor. Here he is speaking for the London Review of Books.
They do. Without their work, as Jude says, the hard readers could not read, nor the high thinkers live. He comes to recognize that the hard readers could not read, academic, but I am a real human being, and I want you to just keep that steadily in mind throughout what I have to say. It doesn't take Jude long to realize that he and his fellow craftsmen are, so to speak, the material base to the intellectual superstructure of the colleges, that without their labour, the colleges couldn't exist as they do, that without their work, as Jude says, the hard readers could not read, nor the high thinkers live. He comes to recognise, in a word, that the origin of culture is labour. Now that lands me with a bit of a problem, because I'm only about a minute into this lecture, and I've already answered the question that I posed in my title. So I'm not exactly sure what I should do.
So he's doing pretty well for himself. He's an 81-year-old in poor health, but he still can bring it.
I can sing some very fine Irish love songs, thank you. I'd better just improvise desperately from now on, if you just bear with me. The origin of culture is labour. This is true etymologically as well, because one of the original meanings of the word culture is the tending of natural growth, is agriculture. And a cognate word, culture, means the blade of a plough. And the kinship between culture and agriculture was brought home to me some years ago when I was driving with the Dean of Arts of a state university in the United States, and we passed farms blooming with luxuriant crops. Might get a couple of professorships out of that, the Dean said. Might get.
All right, so if you're going to make progress in any area, you'll usually be encouraged to understand the words that you're using, right? If you want to join the elite in a particular area, you have to speak the code that the elite speak. Like every group has a code. If you want to succeed with that group, you have to learn the code. If you want to join Orthodox Jews, if you want to join Sunni Muslims, if you want to join, gays in bathhouses in San Francisco, if you want to join NASCAR fans, you got to learn to speak the code of that particular group. And a dictionary can often help out. So the origin of words is incredibly important if you want to have more than a superficial understanding of the world around you.
Get a couple of professorships out of those farms blooming with crops, a state university. Now, this, to be sure, isn't the way culture itself generally likes to see itself. Like the Oedipal child, it tends to disown its lonely or lowly parentage and fantasize instead that it's...
Right, so most of us like to disown that which is lowly in ourselves and to live in a world of fantasy, particularly if you listen to a lot of music. All right, when I listen to music, I just start drifting off into fantasy. And so the more music I listen to, the more fantasy that I live in. And a certain amount of fantasy is probably adaptive. And after a certain amount of fantasy in your life, it becomes maladaptive. In fact, there's even a phrase for it. It's called maladaptive daydreaming. I've been able to add another mental illness to my list. I suffer from maladaptive daydreaming. Why do I spend so much time in daydreaming? Because the reality of my day-to-day life is not the most impressive, and I think of myself as a man of tremendous spirit and ambition, and so I want to escape from the humdrum world of work and ordinary concerns to let my spirit soar, let the mighty eagle soar, to quote a hymn by John Ashcroft.
Sprang from its own loins, self-generating and self-fashioning. Thought, for idealist philosophers, is self-dependent. You can't nip behind it to something more fundamental, since that itself would have to be captured in a thought. Geist goes all the way down.
Okay, what music do I listen to?
Few things bind art more closely to its material surroundings.
I've got a YouTube playlist. I'll throw down a link to that. So here's what's on top. These are the songs that give me energy. Henry Mancini, Nadia's Theme, Summer of 42, The Rose by Bette Midler, Abide With Me by Libra, Nearer, My God, to Thee. Right, I love like 20 different versions of this hymn. Fleetwood Mac, Dreams, All the Way to Reno by R.E.M., Celine Dion, I Drove All Night, Libra, Air from Bach, The Cars singing Dry, which came out in 1984, Bryan Adams, Back to You, Bryan Adams, Heaven, Bryan Adams, Summer of 69, Kelly Clarkson, Because of You, Kelly Clarkson, Since You've Been Gone, Anne Murray, I Just Fall in Love Again, Just Another Woman in Love, Anne Murray, Love Story theme by Henry Mancini, Ennio Morricone, Cinema Paradiso theme, Brideshead Revisited 1981 theme, Legends of the Fall theme, Carpenters For All We Know, Cranberries, Linger, Anne Murray, You Needed Me, I Want to Know What Love Is, Foreigner, Isn't It I Wanted to Go Where Love Is, Journey, Faithfully, Gloria Estefan, Can't Stay Away From You, Herb Alpert, Rise 1979, Casey and the Sunshine Band, Please Don't Go, Fleetwood Mac, You Can Go Your Own Way, Melissa Manchester, Don't Cry Out Loud, Lady by Kenny Rogers, She Believes in Me, Babe by Styx, Elton John, Little Genie, Anne Murray, Broken Hearted, ABBA, The Winner Takes It All, Double, The Captain of Her Heart, Roberta Flack, Killing Me Softly, In Excess, Don't Change, Burn for You, Listen Like Thieves, Only the Lonely by The Motels.
Claim to stand free of them. It's claimed to be autonomous. And that's because the work of art as autonomous and self-determining, which is an idea that goes back really only to the late 18th century, serves as a model of a version of human beings, a version of the human subject that has been rapidly gaining ground in actual life. Men and women are now seen increasingly as authors of themselves, with the deepening influence of liberalism and possessive individualism, and, to perpetrate a dreadful cliché, the rise of the middle classes. If you open a history book at random, it will say three things about the period that you will light on. It will say, first of all, it was a period of rapid change. Secondly, it was essentially a transitional period. And thirdly, the middle classes went on rising.
Okay, so he's sharing here the dominant liberal left ethos, all right, which is that we can decide meaning and morality ourselves, all right? Just in here, we can decide on right and wrong. We can decide on what constitutes meaning and purpose for us. This is the idea of the Buffett identity, that all on your own, in your Buffett individualist identity, that you can figure out right and wrong, that you can figure out a path through life, that you can decide the great moral issues on your own, as opposed to a more traditional conception, which is that we're not primarily individuals. So the modern liberal left ethos is that we're primarily individuals. That is not how I experience life. I experience life that we are primarily members of a tribe or a nation or an extended family, right? And I recognize other people. When I look at other people as I mix through the world, I don't see them primarily as individuals. I see them primarily as members of a tribe or a nation or an extended family. So what also goes with the traditional conception is that our lives are porous, all right? We don't really get to decide meaning and morality on our own. Instead, we are heavily influenced, number one, by our genetics, number two, by our early imprinting, and number three, by the incentives that operate within our tribe, within our community, within our extended family. And so from a traditional perspective, which I hold to, the power of reason is a fairly weak read. From the modern secular humanist liberal left perspective, right, we get to decide meaning on our own, right? That reason is this mighty vehicle that we just have to attach ourselves to reason and follow it wherever it goes, and we'll just have ever-expanding liberty. We'll have gay marriage, we'll have transsexualism, we'll just have ever-expanding civil rights. That's the liberal left conception. And what Terry Eagleton here, who's a Marxist, is articulating is this modern liberal left conception of life, of the individual having a Buffett identity, able to decide morality and meaning on his own, and to create himself. As a trad, I don't see people overwhelmingly as creating themselves, right? I see people overwhelmingly the product of particular genetics, particular early childhood experiences, and shaped by particular membership in a tribe, which comes with it very strong incentives to conform to its hero system.
Why God put the middle classes on Earth, you know, so they could keep steadily rising, a bit like the sun, but not setting. You can't have culture in the sense of galleries and museums and publishing houses unless society has evolved to the point where it can produce an economic surplus. Only then...
Right, so this idea of the capitalists exploiting the workers and taking from them an economic surplus, all right, you can see the Marxist origins of his perspective on life. But if you're watching this show, you're probably a nationalist, and nationalism reveres culture. Nationalism's all about culture. In the nationalist perspective, like, people will live and die for culture.
And some people be released from the business of providing for the physical survival of the tribe in order to constitute a permanent caste of priests, bards, DJs, hermeneuticists, bassoon players, LRB interns. Do I hear an LRB intern?
So he writes for the London Review of Books. My favorite song of late is by Air Supply. I think it's from back in 1980 from their... Can you remember when you first heard Air Supply? Remember their album Lost in Love? Remember their succession of hits? But my new favorite song is American Hearts by Air Supply back in that 1980 album. They were married in September back in 1969. They traveled east to India to find some peace of mind. They stood for love and freedom. They were children of their time. Whoa, whoa. They lived in a world that was cold and uncaring. They swore they would change it with loving and sharing. They'll never live like their parents have done. Their innocence shone like the sun. American hearts, so filled with emotion. American hearts, so easily broken. Now they've got a family and a cottage in the hills. He's always working late to pay the mortgage and the bills, and she has trouble sleeping, so the doctor gives her pills. Whoa, whoa. Who are these strangers who used to be lovers? Now they got nothing to say to each other, too far apart to discuss their mistakes. They filed for divorce, and it breaks their American hearts. Right. There's some fine culture.
Gaffers on film sets and all the rest of it. In fact, you might, a bit riskily maybe, you might define culture as a surplus over strict need. I mean, we need to eat, but we don't need to eat at the Ivy. We need to wear clothes, in cold climates anyway, but they don't need to be designed by Stella McCartney. The problem with that definition of culture, however, is that a capacity for surplus is built into the kinds of natural material creatures that we are. For both good and ill, we're continually in excess of ourselves, for both good and ill. Culture is reckoned into our nature. There's a lot about this in King Lear. Because the material production which gives rise to an economic surplus, gives rise to culture, is racked by conflict, bits of this culture tend to be used from time to time to legitimate the social order which strives to contain or resolve those conflicts, and this is known as ideology. That, I think, is one difference between the notion of culture and the notion of ideology. The notion of culture is wider than ideology. I mean, not all culture is ideological, serves that function at any given time, but any piece of it, however abstract or high-minded, can serve that function in particular circumstances. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that culture can muster some vigorous resistance to the dominant powers. And that happens.
So anything can create the friend-enemy distinction, right? That can be created over culture. Usually it's created over clashing group interests, but religion can also create a friend-enemy distinction, and the enemy is he whose rise threatens the existence, the lives of your group. Right? That's the friend-enemy distinction. That's when politics becomes serious.
Curiously, the more art becomes just another commodity on the marketplace, and the artist just another petty commodity producer. Before that, in traditional or pre-modern society, culture generally serves as an instrument of political sovereignty, which means, among other things, that there are steady jobs for cultural workers.
So this is a great essay here by Terry Eagleton and a great speech, but it accompanies an equally great essay, which I just read in the New Yorker. Work sucks. What could salvage it? And it looks at all these new books that examine the place of work in our lives and how people have tried to change that. But wouldn't it be nice to
as court poets, genealogists, licensed fools, painters patronized by the landed gentry, composers in the pay of princes, and so on. You also know more or less who you're writing or painting or composing for, whereas the marketplace strikes your audience anonymous. So the world now no longer owes the cultural worker a living. Ironically, however, it's the integration of art into the market which allows it a degree of freedom, because once art becomes primarily a commodity, it becomes autonomous, which is
so the more nationalist the culture, the greater the demand for works of culture, the higher esteem is given to culture, and the more opportunities there are for people who make culture to make money.
Say, autonomous of its traditional social functions. Deprived of those ends, it may curve back upon itself, taking itself as its own subject matter, as its own raison d'etre, as in a lot of modernism, but it's also free, if it likes, to become critique for the first time historically on any major scale.
So I mainly talk about politics on this show, but politics that is divorced from culture is transitory, right? It has no resonance. It has no roots. It is legislation. It is a battle here, a conflict there. But any politics divorced from culture, religion divorced from culture, doesn't put down roots.
Histories of commodification, in other words, are also an enthralling moment of emancipation. History, as Marx reminds us, moves by its bad side, progresses by its bad side. In the very process of being pushed to the margin, the artist begins to claim visionary, prophetic, bohemian, subversive status, partly because those on the edges indeed can sometimes see more.
And if the artist in a nationalist culture is able to articulate that the deepest urges that unite a particular people, right, his status is going to rise and his income is going to rise, right? Your life is much happier, as I was talking about with Stephen J. James yesterday, when you're in alignment with your group. And you can almost never get into trouble with your group when you remind your group how much of a victim it is. So for the artist who depicts the suffering of his in-group, the persecution of his in-group, but the glorious hopes for a magnificent future for his in-group, right, that is a pretty solid basis for extracting some money from your art.
More than those in the middle, but also to compensate for a loss of centrality. A movement called Romanticism is born.
This is Terry Eagleton. He's published over 50 books.
Cultural history, more or less from the Stone Age onwards, which cuts the occasional corner every now and then, but I hope you'll forgive that. I'll get on to postmodernism later. A movement called Romanticism is born, and so roughly.
So this guy does not like postmodernism. So the essence of postmodernism is that there's not one narrative that is sufficient for the world that we live in. His argument with postmodernism is that it destroys the idea of truth, some overarching transcendent truth, some overarching objective sense of morality.
At the same time is industrial capitalism, which with admirable convenience gives culture a job of work to do just at the time when it's in danger of being driven out by a lot of Philistine mill owners. There's now a growing divide between the symbolic realm and the world of utility, a divide which runs all the way down the human body. Values and energies for which there isn't much call in the workaday world of bodily labour are siphoned off increasingly into a sphere of their own, one which consists of three major sectors. First of all, by far the most important, religion, then sexuality, and then art. And one of these endangered values.
So from a purely secular perspective, religion is best understood as a subset of culture. But even from a theistic religious perspective, you won't really properly get religion unless you situate it in its particular culture, right? African Christianity is very different from European Christianity, which is different from Japanese Christianity, or different from the Christianity practiced by Aboriginals in Australia, right? Judaism as practiced by Ashkenazi Jews is very different from Judaism as practiced by Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. So I converted to Judaism in 1993, right? So I've had over 30 years of my life going to synagogues, and overwhelmingly I see in synagogues that Persian Jews primarily hang out with Persian Jews, Ashkenazi Jews primarily hang out with Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews primarily hang out with Mizrahi Jews, and Sephardic Jews primarily hang out with Sephardic Jews, even if they're all going to the same minyan, even if they're all going to the same synagogue. All right, they still primarily hang out with each other. Because if you think that Christianity or Judaism, for example, has this essential quality that just transcends all cultural concerns, right, you are completely removed from reality, because Judaism as practiced by Sephardic Jews is night and day different from Ashkenazi Judaism. Judaism as practiced in Africa is different from Judaism as practiced in Ethiopia, right? Very different from the Judaism practiced in Europe and the United States. So you don't really understand religion until you understand the particular culture where religion is being operated. So Khalid Safir was a guest on my show yesterday, and he talked about the eternal verities of Islam. But Islam, like Judaism, like Christianity, looks completely different in different settings, in different cultures. There isn't like the essential Jew, the essential Christian, the essential Muslim, right? Because all three of these religions look completely different in different situations, different circumstances, and different cultures.
That has to be siphoned off and cultivated somewhere else is the so-called creative imagination, which becomes enormously popular. You know, this rather modest faculty of the imagination is inflated by literary types everywhere, you know, into some transcendent capability. The creative imagination, in the sense in which we know it, was invented in the late 18th century. And it's nowadays, as I say, everywhere revered among artistic types, even though organizing genocide in Gaza requires a lot of creative imagination. There's nothing intrinsically valuable about it. So the distance which...
All right, this is an absurd commentary from a literary critic. All right, to be opposed to the quote-unquote genocide in Gaza is at the same time to argue that Israel should allow itself to be attacked, to have its life wrecked by incoming missiles from Hamas and Hezbollah and not respond, right? On the other hand, if you believe that Israel has the right to respond, and to do that, effectively, Israel has to go into Gaza. That means thousands of innocents, thousands of civilians will inevitably die. So either position that you take on the war in Gaza, it's brutal.
Opens between the symbolic and the utilitarian, while threatening to rob culture of much of its social function, to be sure, is also the operative distance which you need for critique. And much of what I'm saying also applies to the university. That also opens an operative distance within itself. And the rest of society scorned sometimes as the ivory tower and so on, but also one of the enabling conditions of critique. Culture would, so the idea went, culture would expose the crippled, diminished nature.
It's really hard to produce any lasting work of analysis or cultural contribution without some considerable spare time. Right? You just can't churn out works of culture the same way that you can bill hours as an attorney.
Of industrial capitalist humanity, not by what it said, but by its own free, full, all-round expression of human powers and capacities, a theme which runs all the way from Schiller and Ruskin to William Morris and Herbert Marcuse. Art and culture can now become a powerful rebuke to society, not so much, as I say, by virtue of what it says or states or shows, but simply because of a strange, pointless, intensely libidinal thing.
Right. When you're fighting for survival, such as many people in Israel feel like they're doing, all right, if you're fighting for the right not to be bombed by Hamas and Hezbollah, then your concerns about culture and your more, highbrow concerns just kind of go by the wayside. People don't tend to produce a lot of culture when they're fighting for their survival, when they're fighting for their way of life, when they're fighting to, for example, create a family without the risk of Muslim terrorists like slaughtering their family. It's hard to produce culture under that kind of pressure.
That it is. It's one of the few remaining activities in an increasingly instrumentalized world which exists purely for its own sake. One of the other members of that extremely small and privileged category is God. God exists purely for his own sake, but also potentially human beings. The point of political change, on this view, is to make that condition increasingly available.
So yes, from a Jewish and Christian religious perspective, I mean, God exists so that he can love us, and he created us not because he needed to, but as an expression essentially of his love.
To as many men and women as possible, so that they too could live for the pure delight of it, or to use a technical theological term, for the pure hell of it. Where art was, there shall humanity be, that romantic humanist promise. The harmonious realization of one's powers as an end in itself. Well, if that's what the aesthetic by this time comes to be about, it's also what the ethics of romantic humanism is about, which for this purpose includes Karl Marx. The aesthetic, I think, only ever becomes important.
So the key thing to understand about romantics and romanticism means that they and it see more to reality than is there.
When it speaks of more than itself, when it's not simply about itself, it becomes somehow allegorical or symbolic of wider issues, and that's just what's happening here. Marx's thought concerns the material conditions which would make life for its own sake possible for whole societies, among which he ranks, very importantly, the shortening of the working day. Marxism, in other words, is about leisure, not about labour. The only good reason for being a socialist, apart from annoying people that you don't like very much, is that you don't like working. And there are a lot of people like that. It's a wonder they're not all socialists. In fact, for Oscar Wilde, who is closer in this respect to Marx than he is to William Morris, communism was the condition in which we would simply lie around all day in various interesting postures of jouissance, dressed in loose crimson garments, reciting Homer to each other and sipping absinthe. And that would just be the working day. There are problems with this vision, as there are with any ethics. The full, all-round, harmonious, symmetrical, etc., realization of human powers, does that mean that all of your powers are to be realized just because you have a capacity? Does that mean realizing it? Some people think so. T.H. Lawrence, for example, thought that. What about that obsessive desire to beat up Tony Blair? You know, does that really demand spontaneous realization? Or should one realize only those impulses which spring from the authentic core of the self?
Right. So from some Marxist perspective, you should follow your inclinations only to the extent that you're helping or empowering, or at least not interfering, the inclinations of others. One of the best journalists around today is Simon Kuper, Kuper. He writes regularly for the Financial Times. He's got a great essay out today. Europeans have more time. Americans have more money. Which is better? And so he notes that Americans have much cheaper consumer goods than Europeans, but services in the United States, particularly with regard to healthcare and education, are much more expensive in America.
That's another theory. But by what criteria does one measure that? What if my self-realization clashes with yours? Enormous problem. The traditional problem of liberal society. And why should all-round expression beat devoting oneself to a single cause, like Alexei Navalny or Emma Raducanu? Also, another big problem, do human capacities become malevolent only by virtue of being alienated, lopsided, or repressed?
So if you devote yourself to one thing, all right, that's inevitably going to come at the cost of your, other forms of human potential. I remember when I started studying calculus and economics, that it severely diminished, if not completely eliminated, my ability to enjoy poetry. Right? It was taken away for years due to the years I spent studying calculus and economics. If you're married with kids, all right, there's not much else you're going to have time for, at least when your children are young, aside from providing for your kids and protecting your kids and looking after your kids.
are they otherwise okay in themselves? And what if, final problem, what if we're half in love with the powers which alienate and repress us, installed as they are on the inside of the human subject rather than purely external to it?
So what the heck is culture? He tackles that in his first paragraph in this London Review of Books essay. He says the origin of culture is labor, and it's also true etymologically. Original meaning of the word culture is the tending of natural growth, which is agriculture, and a cognate word, cultur, means the blade of a plow.
Well, Hegel and Marx have, which is always an excellent way to begin a sentence, Hegel and Marx have an answer of a kind to this problem, certainly to the problem of clashing self-fulfillments, which goes like this: realize only those capabilities which allow others to do the same. Reciprocal self-realization, to which Marx gives the name of communism. Or, as the Communist Manifesto puts it, the free development of each as the condition of the free development of all.
So I just put culture definition into Google, and I found culture, the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. So yes, that must include the greatest hip-hop poetry. Second definition, the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, a particular people, or other social group, such as Caribbean culture.
Fulfillment of one individual is the ground and condition of the fulfillment of another, and vice versa. We call them.
Yeah, that's all very lovely and sounds beautiful, but is there any enforcement mechanism? Is this like a viable approach to culture?
That love. Marxism is about political love.
So Terry Eagleton comes from a Christian background, and there are different words that different people vibrate with, and Christians vibrate to the word love, just like Jews vibrate to the word law. So different peoples, right, have different gifts, and they have different vibrations to different words.
It's just that somebody forgot to mention this to Stalin. You know? I mean, of course, love in its real sense. I mean, you know, caritas, agape, not the sexual, erotic, romantic varieties of it, of which late capitalist society makes such a fetish all the time. We're speaking of the kind of love that can be deeply disagreeable, that you'd rather not have, and that has nothing necessarily to do with feeling. Love that's a social practice rather than a sentiment.
So you'll notice Christians often talk about how much they love Jesus, but they never talk about how much they love Christianity. Jews rarely talk about how much they love God, but they'll talk about how much they love being Jewish, or Jewish history, or Judaism.
And that's in danger of getting you killed. Now, early industrial capitalism had another mission for culture to accomplish. A new actor had just appeared on the political scene, the industrial working class, and was threatening to be obstreperous. And culture, in the sense of the refined and civilized, was thus needed to buy off the other half of Matthew Arnold's celebrated title, Anarchy. Unless liberal values were disseminated to the masses, they might end up sabotaging those values, liberal culture altogether.
Well, it turned out, right, Marxists, the forerunners to Terry Eagleton thought that there wouldn't be anything like World War I because the workers of the world would unite. Well, it didn't turn out that way. When push comes to shove, the workers tend to identify more with their employers who are of their same nation than they do of their fellow workers who belong to a different nation. So when it comes to reality, when it comes to the natural passions, when it comes to the things that people live and die for, nationalism wins out over liberalism every time, because we are not fundamentally individuals with certain inalienable rights, as the liberal perspective teaches, right? We are primarily members of nations, extended families, and whatever rights can be given to us will depend on circumstance. But we're not primarily individuals, we're primarily parts of tribes.
What has traditionally fulfilled that task? Religion, in breeding a sense of duty.
Well, religion used to be a major force for national identity. right? Up until about the 19th century, Christianity was a major force for national identity. So this idea that liberalism was going to buy off the working class with its vision of individual rights and transcendent, human values, I think is naive, right? Because the working class didn't need to be bought off with all this highbrow ideology, right? They already, by the 19th century, believed themselves to be part of a nation, and there is an inherent egalitarian part of nationalism, right? Once you believe that you're part of a nation, there is an egalitarian democratic ethos, a sense of connection with other members of your nation, a sense that you're part of, a much larger whole, and a nation will tend to share a similar hero system. I'd have a similar idea of what kind of behavior is heroic and what kind of behavior is worthy of contempt.
Reverence, deference, obligation, altruism, spiritual edification, and so on. Religion had performed that task pretty well.
And Glib Medley notes, Thomas Fleming at Chronicles magazine says, culture consists of the things that one generation considers worthy of handing down to the next. But the next generation gets the deciding vote. So I disagree with that conception because it's not primarily about what one generation hands down to the next. Right? Culture that means something is primarily about what the younger generation decides to take and perpetuate. Right? So the older generation will try to hand out all sorts of things that it considers culturally valuable, but that culture that endures depends upon the new generation electing it and making it real for them.
But religious belief was now on the wane as the industrial bourgeoisie demythologized social existence by its secularizing activities, which ironically...
Okay, that sounds like super highbrow, but essentially it means there's almost no thought that we think that isn't given to us by society. Almost everything we feel, we get from society. So in America, you'll encounter many women who experience tremendous guilt over having an abortion, as opposed to in Europe and Australia, where virtually no women feel guilty about having an abortion. This idea that abortion is akin to murder is a uniquely American belief, and it was developed as a cynical political strategy in the 1970s. Right? Christianity and conservative political thought do not have long, lofty histories of considering abortion murder or considering abortion the number one moral topic of our day. It was an organizing strategy to bring the disparate parts of a possible Republican coalition together, and they couldn't do it on the basis of maintaining tax-free status for private schools that racially discriminate. Right? That was not going to be a basis for creating a Republican governing majority. Instead, abortion seemed to unite the disparate elements of a possible Republican coalition. It united Catholics and evangelical Christians, Protestants, people who were disgusted with the libertine, dominant liberal culture, right? It brought all these different groups together. And so then as a result of this cynical political strategy, you now have tens of thousands of American women who feel terribly guilty about having an abortion, while this is virtually unknown in Europe. So almost everything that you feel, the guilt that you feel, right, is the product of the hero system of your particular nation. Almost everything you think you get from wider society, right? There's almost no thought, no feeling that is unique to you, right? We hear things. When I talk to people and I try to ask them their opinion about what's going on, given that almost all of my friends are right-wing, what I typically get are lowbrow conservative talking points that they remember from listening to Fox News and talk radio, right? For me to encounter someone who's got something that even begins to approach an original thought, I mean, I go months without encountering people in real life who have anything close to an original thought. Almost everybody I know, every idea they have about the world, they've taken from someone else. They've taken it from society.
Ironically, ended up depleting what had been a precious ideological resource, namely religion. Culture then had to take over from the churches as artists transubstantiated the profane stuff of everyday life into eternal truth. And that project was utterly unsuccessful, which is another story. What else was happening around the time of Romanticism and industrial capitalism? The revolution in France. One might do worse than claim that it was this which thrusts culture to the fore in the modern age. But I mean culture as a riposte to the revolution, culture as an antidote to political turbulence. Politics involves decision, calculation, practical rationality, the time of the present, whereas culture can be thought of as belonging to a different dimension altogether, one in which customs and pieties evolve spontaneously, unconsciously, sometimes with almost glacial slowness. And culture may therefore be seen simply as an idea, irrespective of its particular artifacts, as resistant to the notion of throwing up barricades.
All right, this is a great separation here of politics and culture. Politics involves decisions, legislation, calculation, practical rationality, and takes place in the present. Culture inhabits a different dimension where customs and pieties evolve for the most part spontaneously, unconsciously, with almost glacial slowness. All right, so culture is not primarily something that people can deliberately hand down from one generation to another. Right? Culture does not perpetuate itself unless the new generation decides to seize on it.
Resists the notion, in a certain sense, of political activity as such, which in that light appears more mechanistic and superficial and short-term. And the name for that contrast in Britain is Edmund Burke, who hailed from a nation in which the sovereign power had failed to root itself in the affections of the people because it was a colonialist power. And in Burke's view, this rooting isn't happening either in revolutionary France, since the Jacobins and their successors don't understand that if the law is to be feared, it's also to be loved. So what you need, in Burke's opinion, is a law which, though male, of course, will deck itself out in the alluring garments, female garments of culture. All this is in Burke's early.
Law tends to resonate more with men because men like things that seem objective and hierarchical. Women tend to resonate more with relationships and feelings. So legal systems are set out in very masculine terms, but they are then clothed in the beguiling dress of women.
The essay called On the Origin of Ideas of the Beautiful and the Sublime, not in the French Revolution book. Power must beguile and seduce if it isn't to drive us into Oedipal revolt. The potentially terrifying sublimity of the masculine must be tempered and softened.
And Glib Medley makes some great points in the chat. He says pop culture is just capitalism, it's profit culture. And he notes that Japan has a Shinto ceremony to mourn aborted fetuses. Yeah, but how many millions of Japanese women do you think suffer deep guilt akin to what many American women feel for having an abortion?
By the beauty of the feminine, those two key 18th century.
Right. Japan is not convulsed by the moral issue of abortion. Japan is an intricate island culture that has developed practices and rituals that have a precision and a profundity and engender a respect that is not easy to grasp from the outside.
Aesthetic terms, sublime, the sublime and the beautiful. And this aestheticizing of power is for Burke exactly what the French revolutionaries have calamitously failed to achieve. You mustn't, to be sure, aestheticize power away altogether. The ugly bulge of the law's phallus must be visible from time to time through its diaphanous female garments, so that citizens may be suitably cowed and intimidated when they need to be. Burke is absolutely
right, and this applies to God. All right, God is traditionally described with masculine language. All right, because God is a lawgiver, the decider of right and wrong, and some kind of feminized God is not going to have much of an effect on men. So not only do men need space where they can just have certain parts of the religion kept just for them, right, where certain rituals are reserved just for them, they also need a God who's decidedly masculine or they're not going to be devoted. They're just going to drop out of a feminized religious expression. So mainstream religion, which welcomes in female clergy, is unable to keep men coming back.
Absolutely not against a bit of, cowing and intimidating. But even so, the law can't work by terror alone. And Burke sees this, of course, not just in France, but in his own native Ireland and in India.
And you see that too with the portrayal of God in Judaism and Christianity. It's not just a terrifying God, but you're also given reasons. In fact, you're even commanded to love God. So why on earth would there need to be a command to love God in the Torah? Because it's an admission that God isn't inherently lovable. And so much effort has to be made to develop a love of God. Dennis Prager has this observation that people tend to most love their fellow men, have the hardest time loving God, while people who are the most God intoxicated seem, generally speaking, to be the most indifferent to human suffering. That's my life experience. The God intoxicated, the mystical, those who feel themselves joined with the Godhead, right? Those who spend a tremendous amount of time meditating on God and on theology tend to overwhelmingly be indifferent to human suffering. Those who are most concerned about alleviating human suffering tend to not have much interest in God.
The law can't work by terror alone, which is why it must become a cross-dresser. And that's the only bit of this lecture you'll remember in 2 weeks' time. So Burke believes that the cultural domain, the domain of sentiment, habit, piety, custom, prejudice, and so on, is more fundamental than the political domain to which he dedicated his life. And
yeah, if politics isn't rooted in culture, right, meaning in the expression of a particular people, a particular genetic people combined with a particular environment, right? Australia is the product of overwhelmingly Anglos moving to a particular land, working class Anglos moving to a particular land, and many Irish and some other Europeans, and then producing a society that combines the gifts of a particular genetic alignment with a particular space, a particular environment.
Surely, in one sense, at least, he's right to do so. I mean, there have been some rather suspect, and still are, ways of elevating the cultural over the political, but Burke, who begins his...
So if you understand that what drives politics is overwhelmingly national and nationalist and tribal, then you recognize the importance of culture. And you recognize that politics that is separate from culture has no resonance, has no power, is not going to last. But politics that ties into culture wars, politics that is tied into a particular people's particular identity and particular loyalties to particular blood and particular soil, right? That is the type of stuff that people will live and die for.
Career as an aesthetician, neither despises politics from the Olympian standpoint of high culture, nor dissolves politics into cultural affairs. Instead, he recognizes that culture in the anthropological sense, culture as a way of life and so on, is the place where power has to bed itself down if it is to take hold, if it is to be effective. Culture, in that sense, is absolutely vital for the sustaining and reproducing of power.
Yeah, you're not going to have sustained power, effective use of power, unless it resonates with a particular people in a particular environment, unless it ties to loyalties to blood and soil. Right? Those are the most powerful, most primal loyalties. Prefister says in the Rumble chat, persuasion is making someone think it is their idea. Some people extort the passion of the feelings over the mundane expansion of logic.
If the political doesn't find a home in the cultural, it won't work, and its sovereignty will collapse. And one doesn't have to detest the Jacobins or idealize Marie Antoinette.
Yeah, I mean, how exactly does Joe Biden root himself in American culture? Right? I think Donald Trump is much more of an expression of a particular American culture, particular loyalties to blood and soil, to particular identity, to a particular culture developed by a particular people in a particular space. So that's why loyalty to Donald Trump is much more intense, and there's virtually no loyalty to Joe Biden.
In order to take the point of that, despite his aversion to Jacobinism, but ending up feeling some sympathy for the revolutionary United Irish movement, which sought to drive the British out of Ireland, an extraordinary sentiment, if you think about it, for a British Member of Parliament. The Irish playwright Richard Brinsley-Sheridan, also an MP, was even more dedicated to the United Irish cause, was in fact a secret fellow traveller with it, a fact which, had it been widely known, might have wiped the smiles off the faces of his London theatre audiences. The United Irishmen were Enlightenment anti-colonialists, not romantic nationalists, but the rise of romantic nationalism in the early 19th century once more brings culture to the centre of political life. Nationalism was to prove the most successful revolutionary movement of the modern age.
Yes, nationalism is the most successful revolutionary movement of the modern age. It's the most powerful political force of the last 200 years. We have absolutely no reason to believe that it is going to diminish in the decades ahead.
Toppling despots and dismantling empires, and culture in both its artistic and anthropological senses was to prove vital in this project. With revolutionary nationalism, culture in the sense of language, custom, tradition, history, religion, ethnicity becomes what people are prepared to kill for. Or,
yes, this is what people will kill for or live for. This is the stuff that animates people, gets them out of bed, drives them to the barricades, incentivizes them to sacrifice, to dedicate themselves, to fill themselves with energy and passion and enthusiasm, to take risks.
Prepared to die for. I mean, not many people are prepared to kill for Balzac or David Bowie, but culture in that more specialist sense also plays a key role in nationalist politics. And there are...
So why are people not prepared to die for David Bowie or Balzac? Because David Bowie and Balzac don't tie in to the essence of what it feels like to be an Englishman or a Frenchman. But if you get culture that resonates with people who have a strong attachment to a particular nation and place and to blood and soil, right, then people live and die for it.
And jobs for artists once more, jobs for cultural workers, from Yeats and MacDiarmid to Sibelius and Senghor. They become public figures and political activists. They found something to belong to. Absolutely key historical movement. In fact, nationalism has been described as the most poetic of all forms of politics. When the British shot some Irish nationalists in 1916 in Dublin, a British army officer is said to have remarked to an Irish citizen, "We have done your country some service. We have rid it of some second-rate poets."
So the strongest emotions that drive us are often not particularly rational, right? National loyalties are not best expressed through rational deductive logic. They're often most effectively expressed through poetry, through music, through practices.
Quite a few of the revolutions are actually second rate is rather charitable, given some of their works. The nation itself resembles a work of art, being autonomous, unified, self-determining, self-originating, and as that kind of language may suggest.
Right, people who feel connected to their nation, right, do experience their nation as a work of art, as the location of the most important values of what they revere, all right, is located within their particular nation.
Both art and the nation are beginning to rank among the many surrogates for the almighty that the modern age has come up with, because that language, like...
Right, we move from the age of religion in the Middle Ages to the age of nationalism, which is where we still are.
Most aesthetic language is secretly theological. Aesthetic culture is like religion in all kinds of ways, of course, in its communal rites, in its priesthood of artists, its sense of the numinous, its search for transcendence. And if it fails to replace religion, as it signally does, it's among other things because culture in the artistic sense simply involves too few people, while culture in the sense of a distinctive way of life involves too much conflict.
So Australians love their idiosyncrasies, right? Australians love that which separates themselves from every other nation on earth. You know who's also like this? The most committed Jews. How have Jews survived as a distinctive people when for approximately 2,500 years, they lived primarily as a minority in the diaspora by developing a culture that valued that which was Jewish and devalued that which was Goyish or not Jewish. Right? Jews sustained themselves as a distinct culture for hundreds and thousands of years by continually putting on a pedestal that which was distinctive about them.
The fact is, however, that no symbolic system in history has been able to rival religious faith, which forges a bond between the routine behavior of billions of people and the most ultimate imperishable truths. It's the most enduring, deep-seated, universal form of popular culture that history has ever witnessed, and I bet you won't find it on a single cultural studies course from Sydney to San Diego. For the liberal humanist heritage, culture matters because it represented certain fundamental universal values which might constitute a common ground between those who were otherwise divided. It was a ground on which we could converge, anybody could converge simply with an astonishingly revolutionary idea.
So what enables people to converge? The more you have in common makes it a lot easier to converge, right? The more genetically related you are, the easier it is to bond, right? The more you share genetic lineage, the more you share a culture, the more you share a hero system, the more you share a way of life, the more you share a language, right? A certain outlook on life, a system of right and wrong, right? The more people have in common, the more likely they are to bond, as opposed to our modern veneration of diversity, which celebrates that we have very little in common, which means that we're not going to feel much loyalty to each other, and we're not going to be willing to sacrifice for our fellow American.
Simply by virtue of our shared humanity, not because you were the sum.
Right. That doesn't unite people, shared humanity, right? What unites people is a shared tribe, a shared nation. Very few people feel a close bond with somebody simply because of their shared humanity.
The Viscount or whatever, yes? And in that sense, it was an enlightened notion. But since our shared humanity is a somewhat abstract concept, you needed something to bring this home to experience, something you could see and touch and weigh in your hand. And
yeah, you know what's not abstract? Right, family, extended family. A nation that feels like an extended family, right? That bond to a particular people in a particular place, right? A Los Angeles identity, a California identity. There was a great thing that I just saw on social media listing all the characteristics of Americans. Let me find
that was known as art or literature. If somebody asked you what you ultimately lived by, you gave them not a religious sermon or a political pamphlet, you gave them a volume of Shakespeare, especially if they were your colonials. And the self-interest of that project, as with almost all appeals to unity of any kind, the self-interest is obvious enough. Culture, as with the bourgeois state for Marx, represents an abstract community and equality which compensates for actual inequities and antagonisms. In the presence of the essential and...
So comment in the chat, 40, have you seen TBJP about lately? So TBJP is the big Jew porner, meaning David Sturman, who's the son of Reuben Sturman. Reuben Sturman was the most powerful, influential pornographer of the 20th century, and David Sturman is his son, who served time in prison for trafficking obscene materials. And while he was in prison, he was visited by Chabad rabbis.
And universal, we are invited to suspend our superficial distinctions of class and gender and ethnicity and the like. Even so, this liberal humanist vision captures a truth, I think, in however self-serving a form, that what human beings have in common is in the end more important than their differences. It's just that politically speaking, the end is a long time coming. This vision of culture as deep common ground was challenged by a whole series of developments, certainly from the 1960s onwards, the entry into higher education, to name one of many factors, of people from a background which meant they were disinclined to sign on for that consensus. The concept of culture began to lose its innocence. It had already been compromised by its association with...
So this is a fun and at times profound list, right, from BuzzFeed. What are their listicles here? Okay. Non-Americans are revealing the ways that they can spot an American tourist from a mile away. And I'm both laughing and crying. That's the headline. But these examples are pretty spot on. Let's face it, we Americans have some tendencies that seem totally normal to us, but to the rest of the world, they're super weird. So how do you spot an American tourist from a mile away? They act so amazed by things that are more than 200 years old, presumably because they don't have many things that old in the USA. You can hear them in museums when everyone else is extra silent. So yeah, Americans are enthusiastic and rambunctious. They're constantly wearing their college t-shirt, sweater, or cap because Americans don't have the normal feelings of community that Europeans have. Right? Many Europeans live and die within 10 miles of the spot where they were born. But Americans have life that's much more transitory, so they try to create something that gives them a feeling of community. And so it may be loyalty to your college. Be true to your school. Right. Be true to your school. Beach Boys. Beach Boys. Be true to your school like you would to your girl. Right? This is the profound expression of American culture. When some loud braggart tries to pull me down, says his school is great, I tell him right away, now what's the matter, buddy? Ain't you heard of my school? It's #1 in the state. Hey, 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 take it away. Get that ball and fight. So be true to your school now, just like you would to your girl or guy. Be true to your school now. Let your colors fly. Be true to your school. I got a Letterman sweater with a letter in front. I got for football and track. I'm proud to wear it now. When I cruise around the other parts of town, I got a decal in the back. So be true to your school now, just like you would to your girl. Be true to your school and let your colors fly. Be true to your school. Come Friday, we'll be jacked up on the football game, and I'll be ready to fight. We're going to smash them now. My girl will be working on her pom-poms now, and she'll be yelling tonight. So be true to your school, just like you would to your girl. So it's an American attempt to recapture some of feelings of community that other people in the world have naturally, but Americans must make a great effort to get just an intimation of real community. Tipping. Americans will try to tip everyone, even in countries where tipping isn't a thing and can even be considered insulting. Yeah, Americans tend to be particularly generous people. Asking for the bathroom in a restaurant or public place. Do you need to take a shower? No. What you're really looking for is the toilet. Most of the world calls the bathroom the toilet. Americans are the first to take their shoes off at airport security, even when there is a sign blatantly saying not to remove your shoes. When Americans introduce themselves, they never say they're from the US. They always start with the state or city they are from, because there's no longer much American identity. To the extent that there's still American identity, it's primarily I'm Californian or I'm a New Yorker. They say, hi, how are you? They make conversation with the barista, restaurant servers, retail workers. My country doesn't have that friendly culture. They're absolutely fearless when it comes to asking any random person on the street about anything. Americans tend to be much open than other people. I've watched Americans approach people in my home country and abroad and start conversations with strangers that I wouldn't dream of. Americans always look cheerful and are constantly smiling and seem happy. Tourists from other places look more neutral or even unhappy. Americans are always asking for extra ice in their drinks. They ask for cheese on everything. They ask for to-go coffee cups. Right? Americans work a lot more than other people, so Americans do much more on the run, on the go. Everyone else in Europe sits and drinks their coffee. Americans always seem to be in a rush, so they take their coffee to go. Americans ask things like, what is that in degrees Fahrenheit? How many miles? And that's 2 pounds, right? They assume stores stay open late or 24/7, even in European countries where most stores close by 7 p.m. Americans have impeccable facial hair. Americans must get a trim before they go on holiday. I'm always impressed by their tidy beards and mustaches. The way they dress, for some reason, Americans abroad dress like they're doing some hardcore exploring in the Amazon, even when they're just visiting a European city. They wear white socks pulled all the way up. When they cross the street, they expect cars to stop for them. My country, a car will run you down without the driver thinking twice. They ask for ketchup no matter what they're eating. Everyone else is freezing outside, and then there's that American walking around in shorts as if it's nothing. They get overexcited over ordinary events, say things like, oh my God, look at that grass, how great it is. They pronounce things horribly and make zero attempts to say it correctly. They complain that the portions at restaurants are too small. All right, pretty good list.
Racist ideology and imperialist anthropology in the 19th century, as well as being contaminated by political strife in the context of revolutionary nationalism. From the end of the 19th century onwards, culture became a highly lucrative industry as cultural production was integrated into production in general, and the manufacture of fantasy, mass fantasy, became a deeply profitable pursuit. This, we might note, isn't yet really postmodernism. Postmodernism happens not just with the arrival of mass culture, but with the aestheticizing of social existence as a whole, from design and advertising to branding, politics, a spectacle, tattoos, purple hair, ridiculously large glasses, and so on. Culture, once the very antithesis of material production, has now been folded into production in general. Modernism, now a century behind us, was the last time that culture offered itself as a full-blooded critique.
Hey, we've got Elliott joining the show. Elliott, what's going on, bro?
Blessings, Luke. Can you hear me?
I can, bro. Loud and clear.
Okay.
Powerful.
All right. Powerful. Hey, listen. Yeah, I'm cooking dinner. I'm a little semi-distracted, but I'm going to tell a story about tipping that happened to me yesterday.
Beautiful.
Okay. So, and it also talks about nationalism. So yesterday, you know, Facebook Marketplace, Luke, do you ever use Facebook Marketplace?
No.
Oh, it's the best. It's like the Craigslist that we've always wanted, right? Like you want to buy stuff peer-to-peer from people, regular people in the world. But you can do things like look up their Facebook profile to see if they're sketchy or not, you know, before you commit, you know?
Yes.
It's really the killer app. So anyway, I'm on Facebook Marketplace, and I doubt you noticed this because you're probably not a heavy cooker like I am, but the price of olive oil has basically doubled in the past year.
Oh, and arugula too, man. Arugula.
I haven't noticed arugula, but I'm a heavy consumer of olive oil.
Okay.
So I'm on Facebook Marketplace, and there's this guy selling bottles of olive oil for ultra cheap, and good quality olive oil for ultra cheap. And I'm like, oh, well, I gotta get me some of this. And so he lives in Dublin, California, which is, it's sort of in the Bay Area, but it's, you know, it's decidedly inland, you know, it's by Livermore, and it's kind of way off the beaten track, but it's technically within the Bay Area. But it's called Dublin, you know, as in Dublin, Ireland.
Yeah.
But it has nothing to do with Ireland, except the fact that it's got like green hills in this time of year after a rain. You know how the hills in California get brown very quickly as summer approaches. Yeah. They stay brown until the wet season.
Yes.
So when you're driving to Dublin, California, in the early spring, like we are now, and the hills are green, you can kind of semi-imagine that you're sort of in Ireland because it's got rolling green hills, you know, which I think was probably the inspiration for the name of this town. But this town has no history. I mean, it was probably created in the 70s, you know. It's just all these, you know, housing developments that were just sort of plopped out of the sky onto the hills as if they were just created in like several weeks, you know, these very monochromatic housing developments. They're not these, you know, charming little ancient villages in Ireland made out of stone with stone cobbled streets that sort of evolved over hundreds and hundreds of years. No, these were built in a day. So anyway, that's just to tag on to, you know, something you'd mentioned about true nationalism and
yes,
sort of the authenticity, you know, that Americans crave that you don't have here because everything is so new. But I'm going to sidestep that whole conversation. So anyway, I go to Dublin, California, and I meet this guy, and he's got cases of olive oil, and he's selling them for like $5 a bottle. bottles in the grocery store that would go for like $20. You know, it's an absurdly cheap deal. And so I just, I figured, well, who's to say olive oil is not going to keep appreciating in value? I might as well stock up for the future. So I bought 24 bottles of olive oil, which is ridiculous, right? It's utterly ridiculous. But I figured at the very least they'd make good gifts, at $5 each. If you know people that cook, you can always use another bottle of olive oil. So I buy the olive oil, I drive home. Now, on the way to driving home, I'm passing through Oakland and Alameda. I don't know if you know the geography, but
yes,
Alameda on the first Sunday of every month has a giant antiques market. And when I say giant, it's incomprehensibly large. It's like a mile by a quarter mile of just antique dealers, as far as the eye can see. You literally cannot take it all in at once. But I happen to know a guy there, and I just wanted to say, well, I'm driving by, I'll just check in on him, see how he's doing. And because he was one of the first participants of this antiques market. And I go there, and I go to his traditional spot, and he's not there. So I go next door to a guy who I know knows this guy. I said, well, what happened to Lonnie? His name's Lonnie. And then things got really quiet. Turns out Lonnie had a heart attack.
Oh, no.
But he didn't die. But he was in the hospital. But he's basically been put out of commission, which just shows you the slender reed on which our whole sort of lives exist upon. And so that was very sobering. I thought about that. And then, I just paid $5 to get in just to hear this noise, this bad news, And so I just, after hearing that, I didn't have any appetite for prowling for antiques. I'm really not into, I used to be into antiques. I'm no longer into antiques. And so I went through a couple of stalls, and I just was totally not into it. So I decided I left. All right. And so upon leaving, it's hard to explain that Alameda has this crazy traffic pattern. And on this particular day, it's just glutted with traffic jams because people from all over come on this particular day, and the roads really weren't meant for this much traffic. So I, having lived there many years ago for a brief period of time, knew a shortcut, but the shortcut was very circuitous, and it went through this sort of hipster village, And I went there, and while passing through, I went past a bakery, and I'm like, well, I could use some bread. So I stopped, went in, and then I bought some bread. I went to this bakery, and I got a loaf of bread. Then I went up to the counter, and most of my stories involve a counter interaction.
Yes.
Because I had to suffer another counter interaction to talk about. But so I get there, and the woman behind the counter had this bizarre birth defect. And like her arms were like half the size of what normal arms should be.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine that. Just take your arm and cut it in half.
Yeah.
So it's like these little lobster claws that just kind of jutted out, these little disfigured hands, hand-like things. And she just looked really strange. And like, this is something I'm just not equipped for. I can't handle visions like this because I just can't process like what it would be like to go through life like that, because life is hard enough as it is,
Yeah.
And then you just layer on that. And you're like, it just seems like utterly impossible. Nevertheless, here she was in the public, working, for God's sake. If some people deserve welfare, if you've got little stubby lobster claws for arms, I think you can have welfare and feel good about it. But anyway, not her. She was working behind the counter. And so I paid for the bread. Bread was like $7.99, and then plus tax, it was like $8 and change. Right? It was good bread. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And so normally, like your basic checkout transaction is about 30 seconds or less. You Here's the money, here's the change, and you're out of there, right? But because she had like these little stubby arms and weird claws for hands, the whole thing took like 5 solid minutes. You know, like every little thing she had to like turn her body so she could get her claws onto the $1 bills, and then get the $5 bills and the $10 bills, and then, you know, get the change. You know, the whole process took like a full 5 minutes, right? And then she would sort of lurch her body forward and then extend her little half arm to me, and I would take the bills, and then she would give me the coins, you know. So I had like one hand full of coins. I had the coins in one hand and the bills in the other, right?
Yeah.
And there was a tip jar, right?
Yeah.
You know how you were talking about tips earlier, right? And so I'm looking at the tip jar, and the tip jar is closest to my hand with the coins. But ethically, I'm thinking, well, if anybody really deserves a tip in this circumstance, it's probably her. So she deserves some bills, right?
Yeah.
So I sat there and I was like in this huge moment of cognitive dissonance. But as you know, lately I've been on this huge thrift kick.
Yeah.
Know? So I took the easy way out, bro. I just gave her the coins and I kept the bills. And I got the hell out of Dodge, you know?
Yeah, well, she's not family. She's not extended family.
No, she's not. She's an out-group for all I know.
She's out-group. She's one of those claw hands people. They're different from us. They don't love the same things that we love.
Yeah. And so I did that, and I got my car, and I was able to sort of Clinton-like compartmentalize this act of mine, this greedy, sort of cheap act of mine. I was able to sort of block it out for like 2 minutes. But then I'm back in the car and I'm sitting in traffic because there's still lots of traffic trying to get off this island because of the antiques fair. And I'm just sitting there in traffic and I'm just fucking hating myself. You know? Yeah. It really wouldn't have made a difference if I just gave her like a dollar bill. But I had to cheap out and give her the coins instead, you know? And I was just sort of completely clobbering myself about this. Do you ever do this? Do you ever sort of beat yourself for not tipping sufficiently?
No, not over tipping, but I mean, self-loathing will overwhelm me at times, and when I've been rude or insensitive to someone, or I've done something that other people interpreted in a completely different way than I understood. But no, I can't say that I've ever felt bad for not tipping more.
Yeah, but that's sort of the the compartment. What do you call it? The buffered identity. You know, the religious offering among the sort of the secular is the tip at the coffee shop, right? It has the same sort of religious meaning that the offering dish does at a church. So anyway, I thought it was something I'm reflecting on.
So I got friends who use food delivery apps, and they always instruct the driver to drop the food outside so that they don't have to confront him face to face and feel any kind of moral qualms about not tipping him.
Or not tipping them at all?
Correct.
Oh, that's harsh, bro. Not even I could do that, bro. I mean, I would. Well, lately, remember the days when the expected tip was 15%?
Yes.
And now it's 20, even 22%. Like you get a receipt and they have this recommended tip. And at the very bottom of the barrel is the old 15% traditional. But then they'll go to 20, and then 22, 25. I'm like, yeah, what the hell? Why not? 25. 25% of this bill I'm going to give to this person who brought it to me. You know?
And then so many places where you just you order a yogurt, and when you check out, the machine asks you do you want a tip? I mean, it's ridiculous how extensive tipping is just being inserted into the most elementary of transactions these days.
I agree totally. And it's sort of this. I think this is sort of uniquely American because in Europe, I believe, the establishment owners just pay their employees a proper wage and don't rely on this sort of chance, you know. But in a strange way, it does incentivize better service, you have to say.
Yes, yeah, there's better service in America. There are many advantages to this. Americans are known as particularly generous people. I'm not a big tipper, but I'm not the worst, probably around 15%, though not if I'm just like buying a yogurt. I'm not going to leave a tip like that.
Yeah. I remember one of my first jobs in high school, I was a bellboy. So we had this hotel. You know, like all throughout New England and upstate New York, there's these, they would call them Jewish hotels, like Catskills. But I lived in Maine, you know, and we had one of these, and I worked at one of these. And as a bellboy, the clientele was about 50% WASP, about 50% Jewish, and the Jews were better tippers, bro. Much better, like obscenely better.
Yes.
Like I would get, you know, it was like the difference between getting $1 and I would get a $5 bill. And back then a $5 bill meant something, you know? And like I had come to expect that the Jewish clients would slip a $5 on me, or sometimes even more. I don't know why that is.
You know, Amazon used to keep the tips given to their drivers.
Oh my God. Really?
Yeah.
That's terrible. That's terrible. Well, yeah, I didn't have much to say beyond that. I just want to relate that story. All right. So I'm going to
thank you for sharing.
All right. Blessings. All right.
Blessings, bro.
Blessings.
Right, not from left. If it does so no longer, neither does culture in the sense of a specific form of life. Most such life forms today are not out to question the framework of modern civilization, but, magic word, to be included within them. Inclusion, however, isn't a good in its...
Right. The most useful, the most realistic form of inclusion is to be genetically close to people, to be religiously and culturally close to people, to share a similar hero system, to live in the same place, right? To have similar loyalties to a nation.
Itself, any more than diversity is a good in itself. One thinks fondly of Sam Goldwyn's cry, "Include me out."
The idea that diversity is just good in and of itself is ludicrous.
All of that is sometimes known as cultural politics and has given rise in our own time, of course, to so-called culture wars. And that's very strange because, for Schiller and Arnold, Coleridge, the phrase culture wars would have been an oxymoron. Like, say...
Well, it's not weird when you understand that culture springs usually from a particular people with a particular genetics in a particular place, and it's this national expression that perpetuates culture and gives it its power. So culture is often a reflection of a particular nation, and different nations have different interests.
Business ethics. Samuel Beckett once remarked that he has strong weakness for an oxymoron. The opposite of an oxymoron, I suppose, is a tautology, isn't it? For example, Scientology, which means the knowledge of knowledge. Yes, somebody should tell Tom Cruise that sometime. Or what about internet? I think internet may be a tautology. Any nets that aren't inter? Anyway, I'd love to give a lecture on oxymorons and tautologies, but some other time. The point is, people like Coleridge and Schiller and Ruskin and so on, culture was the solution to strife, not an example of it. Now, however, culture is no...
And that's a very liberal perspective, that somehow culture will remind us of our common humanity. But the type of culture that has the most resonance is not culture that reminds us of our common humanity, it's culture that reminds us of a very particular type of humanity. Right? The culture that moves the world, the culture that people will live and die for, is not a culture about our universal humanity. It's a culture about our ties to a particular people in a particular place, a distinct way of life, a distinct hero system, right? A perspective on life, a group, a tribe, an extended family, right? That we revere more than all other nations. That's the culture that lives on.
Longer a way of transcending the political or dissolving it, but the very language in which certain key political demands are framed and articulated. And that really is a strikingly original development. Far from being a spiritual solution, it's become part of the problem. And we have shifted in the process from culture, singular, to cultures, plural. I've just cut out.
Well, if you had one dominant culture, this wouldn't be a problem, because when you have one dominant culture, it enables people to have self-confidence, esprit de corps, high morale, right? That comes from belonging to one dominant culture that you don't feel is under threat, right? That you don't believe is going to get demographically swamped.
Some rather boring stuff here, and move rapidly on. In our own time, culture has become nothing less than a full-blown ideology known as culturalism, yes? Along with biologism, moralism, historicism, economism. Culturalism is one of the great intellectual reductions, forms of reductionism of the day. On this theory, culture goes all the way down. The nature of humanity is culture. And behind that doctrine lurks a very curious aversion to nature, which is one of culture's traditional antitheses, not the only one, but one, as obdurate, as brutally given, as inflexible, as resistant to change, and so on. At precisely the point where nature is capricious, unpredictable, alarmingly fast-moving, disintegrating before our eyes, culturalism insists on regarding it as inert and immobile. It's not, I think, that culture is our nature, but that culture is of our nature. Culture is both possible and necessary because of the kinds of bodies we have. It's necessary because there's a gap in our nature which culture, in the sense of physical care, must move into quickly if we're to survive as infants. Infants absolutely need culture because there's a whacking great hole in our nature which demands it. Culture is possible because our bodies, unlike those of snails or spiders, are able to extend themselves outwards, both by the power of labor and by the power of conceptual thought or language. And this prosthesis to our bodies, this ability to keep extending them further and further, is known as civilization. The only problem, as ancient Greek tragedy was aware, is that we can extend ourselves too far. We can lose contact with our sensuous, instinctual being, overreach ourselves, and bring ourselves to nothing. But that's another story. Since we have a couple of minutes in hand there, I'll sing you an Irish love song. On Raglan Road.
Okay, so you're probably wondering, 40, what's happening with your TikTok? So here we go.
Why am I willing to try things that make no sense to me? Because tens of thousands of hot chicks in spandex can't be wrong. You go to yoga class, there are 3 times as many women as guys, and about half the chicks are hot, 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 hot. So I'm willing to give it a chance. And why am I willing to try things that make...
Okay, what else have I got?
Rapid antigen test here. I was so sick, I just didn't want to figure out how to use it. I had so little bandwidth. Like, I just wanted to use my bandwidth to meet my most pressing obligations, and then just let everything else go. And it's kind of a state of nihilism that I go into anyway when I get sick. Not 100% nihilism in that I made sure that I still met my 12-step obligations as a sponsor, not out of my altruistic concern for my sponsees, but because I knew that would be good for me. I knew that I would feel better if I was actively engaged in being helpful to other people.
Man, sound levels really suck there, sorry.
You gotta be a different person in different places. Now, if you're an alcoholic or, a chronic debtor or spender, yeah, those problems are going to go with you. But you can move somewhere, start sleeping better, you might have more friends, you might make more money, you might thrive. And we're profoundly affected by the company we keep, situations we place ourselves in, the jobs we take, the education we get. It's not just all about us and our internal state. So I am in Sydney, Australia right now, heading towards Clovelly Beach. And all the problems that I had in Los Angeles, I've left behind, almost all of them. Like, I feel free.
Okay, what other great quality content do I have here?
I got into like game mode, and suddenly one becomes much less inhibited, because in real life, nobody listens to me for longer than 30 seconds maximum at a time without interrupting me and telling me I'm stupid. But online, nobody knows I'm a dog. Like online, I can stream for 9 hours on a Sunday and people will tune in and listen. And so that creates, like, first of all, a disinhibition, meaning I'm much less inhibited once I turn on that broadcast live button, and the things that would normally hold me back are just not there anymore. And so all sorts of things that are latent during the workaday world, during my real life, when I go to synagogue, they all drop away. And so I become much more revealed, and that's not always a great thing. I got into like game mode.
So what counts for all these short videos I put out? Because it's a dramatic way to get more views and more subscribers. So I've had between 5 to 10 times the number of views over the past week that I normally have.
Qatar,
so back to
getting
Sydney
the World Cup.
commentary.
It's a great example of how much of the world works, right? By things going on behind the scenes, secret deals, skullduggery, right? All sorts of things don't make sense, that are bad for soccer in this instance, right? Bad for fans, bad for the world. Right? Why did this happen? Because a small number of people got bribed. So a lot of things happen because you've got a small number of people who are able to make things happen, even if it's bad for the group. So the incentives for corporations aren't exactly the same as the incentives for leading individuals in a corporation. The incentives for a group are not the same as the individual incentives for people who dominate the group. So when you ask who benefits, then that's a great way of opening up how the world works. Like, who benefits from this scam? Who benefits from Qatar getting the World Cup?
Okay, that's going to do it for me for right now.